If AOC got to write history books and they said, why do people sneak into America? Oh, climate change.
Climate change is different because we have an expiration date.
Imagine a world where Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, widely known as AOC, is tasked with writing history books. In this hypothetical scenario, her narrative might frame complex global issues through a singular lens. For instance, when addressing the question, why did people sneak into America? Her answer could be a resounding climate change. According to this perspective, climate change is not just a contributing factor but the primary driver of migration, with an urgent expiration date looming. She might claim that in 20 years, the environmental crisis will have escalated to such an extent that people will be trekking from Guatemala, not to settle in border states, but to secure plane tickets to places like Michigan. This narrative hinges on a dire warning. Humanity has a mere 12 years to reverse the catastrophic trajectory of climate change. But is this perspective grounded in reality? The assertion prompts skepticism. Are we certain that climate change alone will force such specific migratory patterns? Could there be other variables at play, economic instability, political corruption, or violent regimes perhaps? The complexity of migration suggests a web of causes, not a single thread. AOC's framing risks oversimplifying a multifaceted issue, potentially ignoring the economic desperation or political persecution that often drives people to leave their homelands. The concern here is that by focusing solely on climate change, we might become like the proverbial frog in a pot of boiling water, unaware of other dangers until it's too late. Adding to the skepticism, consider the possibility of other influences on migration patterns. For instance, what if reports surfaced about border crossings where certain groups, say from China, were disproportionately represented? Imagine stops along migration routes where signs are in Chinese and local intermediaries primarily speak Mandarin. Could this suggest a coordinated effort to facilitate specific groups' entry into the U.S.? While AOC's history book might dismiss such observations as irrelevant, insisting that climate change is the sole culprit, others might argue that geopolitical strategies or economic incentives could be at work. The refusal to consider these variables risks a myopic understanding of global dynamics. The fear is that endless debates over climate-driven migration will paralyze action. Policymakers might argue incessantly, only to produce a feeble response, like a watered-down carbon tax, leaving future generations to grapple with the consequences. This scenario paints a picture of a world where ideological purity trumps practical solutions, and the stakes couldn't be higher. The question is whether AOC's narrative, with its dramatic flair and urgent deadlines, holds up under scrutiny or if it's more performative than substantive. This critique of AOC's approach isn't new. Commentators like Bill Maher and Joe Rogan have increasingly taken aim at her, blending humor with sharp criticism. Their verbal sporing has become a cultural phenomenon fueled by revelations that challenge AOC's carefully crafted image. For instance, a wave of reports recently questioned the authenticity of her upbringing. While AOC has often portrayed herself as a working-class Bronx native, evidence suggests she spent much of her childhood in Yorktown, a more affluent suburb in Westchester County. School records and yearbooks corroborate this, contradicting the narrative of a scrappy, inner-city upbringing. Additionally, claims like cashing her grandmother's Social Security checks have been debunked as satire, further eroding her credibility. Maher and Rogan have seized on these discrepancies, delivering what some describe as relentless verbal beatdowns. Their critiques are not just personal but ideological, targeting AOC's tendency to prioritize soundbites over substance. Rogan, in particular, has undergone a dramatic shift in his view of AOC. When she first burst onto the political scene in 2018, defeating a 10-term incumbent in a stunning upset, Rogan was effusive in his praise. He marveled at her oratory skills, her youth, and her grassroots campaign, which triumphed despite being outspent 10-1. Clips from that time capture Rogan's genuine excitement, describing her victory as a testament to the power of underdog politics. He even called her win one of the realest moments, highlighting the raw emotion of her reaction video. Yet, as AOC's tenure in Congress progressed, Rogan's admiration waned. What began as intrigue turned to disillusionment as her carefully curated image unraveled. Where he once saw a trailblazer, he now sees a politician who thrives on theatrics but falters under scrutiny. His podcast discussions have grown increasingly mocking, dissecting her claims with a mix of humor and frustration. For instance, Rogan has ridiculed AOC's assertion that climate change will necessitate mass migration to places like Michigan, questioning the logic of such a specific prediction. He's also challenged her 12-year deadline for solving climate change, arguing it ignores the complexity of global environmental systems. Maher, meanwhile, has taken a similarly biting approach. In one memorable segment, he lampooned AOC's tendency to frame every issue through a lens of social justice, joking that even if giant robotic tripods were vaporizing New Jersey, Democrats like AOC would focus on how the death lasers disproportionately harmed marginalized communities. The punchline landed because it resonated with a broader critique. AOC's rhetoric often prioritizes ideology over practicality. Maher's satire extends to her defense of unchecked immigration, which he argues ignores real-world consequences like rising crime, strained public services, and overwhelmed law enforcement. He suggested that Democrats, with AOC at the forefront, would defend even hypothetical Martian invaders in the name of compassion, a jab that underscores the perceived disconnect between their rhetoric and reality. This shift in perception reflects a broader trend. AOC's initial appeal, her youth, charisma, and outsider status, captivated millions, including figures like Rogan. But as her tenure has unfolded, her refusal to evolve has drawn criticism. 5 years into Congress, she continues to rely on oversimplified narratives, like attributing mass migration solely to climate change or claiming expertise on issues where she falters under questioning. One infamous example is her 2018 interview on PBS, where she confidently declared herself an expert on the Israel-Palestine conflict, only to stumble when asked to define the occupation of Palestine. Her response devolved into vague generalities, revealing a lack of depth that undercut her earlier bravado. This pattern, bold claims followed by shaky follow-through, has become AOC's Achilles heel. In another instance, she attempted to challenge Tony Bobulinski, a witness testifying about alleged corruption involving Joe Biden. AOC pressed him to specify what crime he had witnessed, expecting to trip him up. Instead, Bobulinski calmly cited corruption and RICO violations, leaving AOC visibly flustered. Her apparent unfamiliarity with these legal terms exposed a gap in her knowledge, turning her attempted gotcha moment into a self-inflicted embarrassment. Critics argue this reflects a broader issue. AOC thrives in echo chambers, but struggles in open debate, where facts and logic take precedence over emotion. Her missteps aren't limited to high-profile interviews. AOC's misunderstanding of legislative details has also drawn fire. For example, she criticized a bill championed by Representative Mike Lawler, claiming it favored tax breaks for billionaires while punishing low-income tipped workers. Lawler swiftly debunked her, explaining that the bill included permanent tax deductions for middle and lower-income families, as well as measures like no taxes on tips or overtime. AOC's failure to grasp the bill's basics underscored her tendency to prioritize rhetoric over research, a pattern that critics say undermines her credibility. Despite these shortcomings, AOC retains a loyal following, drawn to her charisma and progressive ideals. Her ability to command large crowds at events like festivals or rallies is undeniable, as is her knack for viral moments on social media. Yet, as Maher has pointed out, big crowds don't necessarily translate to electoral success. He cited the 2024 election, where Kamala Harris drew massive audiences and raised over $1.5 billion, only to suffer a crushing defeat. Maher's argument is that Democrats, including AOC, are too focused on optics, celebrity endorsements, TikTok videos, and flashy rallies at the expense of substantive leadership. Without a course correction, he warns, the party risks repeating its mistakes in 2028. AOC's presidential ambitions, floated by some supporters, are particularly contentious. Critics argue she's ill-equipped for the role, citing her lack of diplomatic finesse, intellectual rigor, and policy depth. Her rhetoric, while galvanizing for progressives, is seen as too divisive for a national audience. Moreover, her refusal to temper her woke persona alienates moderate voters who prioritize competence over ideology. Even her defenders acknowledge that at 35, she lacks the experience needed for the presidency. While youth isn't inherently a barrier, Teddy Roosevelt was 42 when he assumed the role. AOC's reluctance to grow beyond her current persona is. That said, AOC isn't beyond redemption. She's still young, with time to hone her skills and broaden her perspective. If she embraced humility, sought mentorship, and prioritized learning over lecturing, she could evolve into a formidable leader. For now, though, her reliance on performance politics, dramatic speeches, viral tweets, and rehearsed outrage outweighs her substance. The clock is ticking, not just on climate change, but on her political future. If AOC wants to be taken seriously, she must step back, reassess, and commit to growth. Until then, she remains a polarizing figure, a symbol of progressive hope for some, and a caricature of ideological excess for others.